Ashamed of his wife during negotiations with foreigners, her husband took a mistress. And when he found out what surprise awaited him, the wealthy man was stunned. The morning was already in full swing. It was summer, birds were singing outside the window and bathing in the puddles left by the night rain. Looking out the window, one's soul felt at ease. Jennifer placed a plate of pancakes on the table, fluffy and golden brown, just like the cheeks of her youngest son, Donald. William, the elder, was already sitting at the table, his nose buried in his phone. He was just like his father, short, with the same unruly black mop of hair. "Good morning, everyone," Jennifer said, setting Donald in his high chair. He immediately shoved a piece of pancake into his mouth, squinting with pleasure. "Good morning," replied 10-year-old William, not looking up from the screen. At that moment, her husband walked into the kitchen, dressed in full formal attire and smelling of expensive cologne. A business suit, tie, and flesh-colored shirt. From the outside, Matthew looked like a man who had achieved everything he wanted in life. But in reality, it was far from the truth. "Hello, everyone," he mumbled, passing by his wife to get a carton of milk from the fridge. "Good morning," Jennifer replied, and immediately felt a flicker of anxiety stir within her. Even the bitter taste of coffee seemed to her no stronger than ordinary water. "I'm going on a business trip today," Matthew announced, filling a glass with milk. Jennifer looked at her husband with concern. "A business trip?" she asked. "For how long?" "Well, I don't know yet. Maybe 3 days. Maybe less. We'll see. We have negotiations with new foreign partners, an important deal coming up," Matthew replied with feigned indifference. "And what about the boys? You promised to take them fishing at the lake," she asked. "And what about the boys?" "They'll be fine. William is already grown up, he can take care of himself. 10 years old, after all. A groom already. And Donald? Well, if necessary, he'll stay with Grandma. But they're still little." Jennifer protested. "Oh, come on. Don't make them into weaklings. Their mother will look after them if needed. And don't worry, I'll be back soon." Jennifer looked at her husband sadly. He spoke as if she wasn't their children's mother, but some stranger who couldn't take care of them. At that moment, Jennifer felt unnecessary and even redundant. She also had a sudden inkling that her husband was ashamed of her, didn't want her to be seen with him during negotiations. What was wrong with her? Had she gained weight? Yes, a little. Maybe a couple of kilograms at most. Was that so critical? And you'll be leading the negotiations yourself? What about the interpreter? You always took me with you, Jennifer asked timidly. Of course, I'll do it myself. Why distract you from your work? You're busy with tutoring. Buried in work up to your ears. Better prepare your students and applicants for their exams, Matthew replied, forcing a smile. Who else will be there? Jennifer asked again, feeling unable to stop the rising wave of sadness. Oh, many people. Don't worry, everything will be fine, her husband said, approaching her and giving her a peck on the cheek. The kiss was so artificial and staged that it felt like her cheek had been touched by a mannequin's lips. Then he grabbed his business briefcase and headed for the door. Well, take care. Don't miss me too much. Keep your chin up, he said, winking at William. Jennifer remained sitting at the table, staring out the window. She felt lonely and abandoned. She wanted to go with her husband, but she knew it was impossible right now. After all, she had always helped Matthew before, serving as his interpreter. It was very convenient. Jennifer knew several languages and was indispensable during negotiations. But that was before, when Matthew was still an emerging businessman needing help, support, and understanding. Now he had spread his wings and become independent. What use was a wife who was a translator? He could manage and find a professional interpreter. What was a wife who earned a living through tutoring worth? Jennifer sat for a while longer, then picked up a photograph from the counter by the fridge. It showed her and Matthew on their wedding day. The young couple looked at the camera with smiles on their faces and unhidden optimism. She sadly thought about how they truly loved each other back then, but now everything had changed. Jennifer smiled as she remembered how she first met Matthew. At that time, he was a young, ambitious guy who worked on house construction and dreamed of his own business. She worked as a teacher at a school. Matthew attracted her with his boundless energy and self-confidence. Strong, attractive, how could she not fall in love? But years passed, and Matthew changed significantly. He became tough and ruthless. He had also turned into a person Jennifer no longer understood. In his rush to make money, her husband forgot that he had a family. He was literally obsessed with his career and success. She looked at her reflection in the mirror with sadness. Jennifer saw a tired woman with eyes full of indescribable longing and sorrow. At that moment, she realized she was no longer the young and beautiful girl gazing at the world from a glossy photograph. "Mom, are you crying?" Donald asked. Jennifer forced a smile and hugged her son. "No, sweetheart, just got something in my eye." "Don't worry, I'm fine," she replied. "Is Dad coming back soon?" the little one asked. "Soon, darling. He's going far away for now, but he will remember and love you," she said, though she wasn't sure if soon would be the case. Donald looked at his mom with confusion. He was still too young to understand what negotiations and new business partners meant. Jennifer held her son close and kissed the top of his head. She was sure that she and her sons would get through all the difficulties and that their love would remain as strong as ever. But her heart felt uneasy. She felt as though her world was splitting in two. One part was with Donald and William, her dearly loved sons. The other was with Matthew, who was drifting further away from her with each passing day. Jennifer felt she could no longer see her future. She didn't know what awaited them ahead, and it scared her. Nevertheless, she was determined to manage, to be strong and independent. She would move forward, despite everything, for the sake of her children. The day passed quickly. In a burst of emotions, Jennifer sent Matthew messages and called him, but he responded briefly and without emotion. He said he was busy with work, was tired, and couldn't waste time on idle chatter. Of course, Jennifer felt that her husband's words were insincere. She also understood that he was growing more distant from her. A chasm was growing between them. At that moment, she tried to remember when it all began. When did Matthew stop calling about trivial matters, sharing his future plans, or asking how she was doing? Listening to his vague excuses, Jennifer felt that she was losing her husband. Not so long ago, she had been the center of Matthew's universe. Now, she had become just a pale shadow against the backdrop of his ambitions. On the other hand, what else could she do? Life goes on, and her husband would sort things out. It was his business, after all. Meanwhile, Matthew nervously adjusted his tie, looking at his reflection in the mirror of his luxurious hotel room. "Almost ready," he muttered, scrutinizing his appearance. The suit fit perfectly, the shirt was crisply ironed, and his face wore a light, confident smile, which he believed should win over everyone he was to meet today. The only thing troubling him were thoughts of the interpreter Maggie, who had recently become his lover. The enchanting beauty stood beside him, casually playing with the red coral necklace he had given her last month. Matthew felt that her presence was casting doubt on his potential triumph. "Everything will be fine, don't worry. You know I'll be there and help if needed," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "Yes, I know, Maggie. I just can't help feeling a bit anxious," Matthew replied. Of course, he wasn't foolish enough to think Maggie could support him in negotiations. Her language skills were not on par with Jennifer's, who could negotiate with any continent even in her sleep. "How did your wife take it?" "I don't think she'll mind, will she? After all, you haven't told her about us yet, have you?" Maggie asked, catching his thoughtful glance. "Don't worry, she doesn't know anything. And, anyway, she has other things on her mind right now. We'll get through these negotiations, and then I'll tell her about us," Matthew promised, pulling Maggie close by the waist. "Well, I definitely like your business proposal," Maggie purred, softly kissing her lover on the cheek. Matthew looked at Maggie with pride. What a beauty she is. A real treat to the eyes. My blood's boiling with excitement. Matthew loved Maggie. She was his secret and forbidden passion. He couldn't give Jennifer what he gave Maggie: expensive jewelry, dinners in fancy restaurants, and nights in luxury hotels. Of course, Jennifer was a good wife, homemaker, and mother. But Matthew wanted something different in life, something thrilling and forbidden. Something that made his head spin and his heart race like crazy. "Well, shall we go?" "They're probably waiting for us," Matthew said, smiling at Maggie and taking her by the arm. The red-haired beauty flirtatiously winked, indicating she was ready for anything. In the car, the atmosphere was tense. Matthew kept thinking about his project, mentally rehearsing every word of his speech. Maggie sat beside him, silently observing. Seizing the moment, Matthew took her hand and kissed her fingers. "I'm happy you're with me." She nodded in agreement, silently conveying that she shared his feelings. When Matthew finally arrived at the office of his foreign partners, he was greeted by a tall, blonde secretary with cold gray eyes. Matthew felt her penetrating gaze. "Welcome, Matthew Adrian. Gabriel Albertson is already expecting you," she said with a slight accent. "Thank you," Matthew replied, nodding to Maggie to follow him. He deliberately delayed introducing her as his interpreter. The businessman wanted her to be there simply as his companion. He wanted to see her eyes and hear her voice. A minute later, they entered a huge office filled with powerful computers and designer furniture. Behind the desk sat a man in glasses, dressed in a black suit. He was tall and thin, with sharp features and a cold gaze. On either side of him were two younger men, clearly his assistants or deputies for various matters. "Gabriel Albertson," Matthew said, extending his hand. "Matthew Adrian, very pleased to meet you," replied the businessman, slightly mingling the words with a pre-learned phrase. Standing up from behind the desk, Gabriel shook the guest's hand. He then turned his gaze to Matthew's companion. "Maggie," she introduced herself, smiling charmingly. Matthew sat down in a chair opposite Gabriel Albertson. Maggie stood beside him, unsure of what to do next. To be honest, she had never attended negotiations of such a high level before. And generally speaking, the term negotiations meant absolutely nothing to Maggie. "We are ready to discuss your proposal," Gabriel continued, indicating the documents laid out before him. This phrase indicated to Matthew that Gabriel's knowledge of the language had run out. Matthew nodded understandingly and, taking the files, opened the first one. At that moment, he felt his hands were filled with an invisible energy. Matthew knew that a lot was at stake now, as this was the most important project of his life. "I would like to propose a joint investment in the construction of a new factory," Matthew said, looking confidently at his interlocutor. After a necessary pause, he began his presentation, describing technical details, equipment, processing methods, and project delivery. Maggie sat beside him, diligently translating everything he said. Gabriel listened attentively, occasionally asking questions in different languages, which soon made Maggie noticeably lose her rhythm and struggle to translate everything in a timely and accurate manner. Matthew looked at her and felt he had made a big mistake bringing her along. The businessman realized he was losing control of the situation. He wanted to be the center of attention, to be the brains of the deal, but the foreigners had quickly seized the initiative. Soon, Maggie completely lost track of the conversation and, frankly, was tired. Matthew sat silently, watching the foreigners babbling in their language. Honestly, he could no longer understand what was happening. Maggie was desperately trying to regain her footing, but was falling behind. She managed to translate some parts, but not all. Matthew felt out of his element. Meanwhile, the foreigners seemed to talk endlessly, as if intentionally prolonging the situation. If only Jennifer were here now, she would sort everything out in no time, the businessman thought. But he, of course, didn't dare to say it out loud. All he could do was hope that Gabriel wouldn't try to take advantage of him. And Maggie, of course, isn't much better. Couldn't she have prepared better? Matthew's frustration reached boiling point when Gabriel finally said, "Well, I think we've almost resolved all the important issues. So my partners and I would like to propose that you, Matthew Adrian, meet again for the signing of the documents. When would be convenient for you?" Fortunately, Maggie translated this phrase flawlessly. "How about tomorrow at the same time?" Matthew said, seizing the opportunity for a delay with relief, still trying to recover from the situation. "Excellent, then I won't keep you any longer. See you tomorrow," Gabriel said, rising from the desk and extending his hand. "Thank you for the quality translation, madam. In my opinion, you did an excellent job." "See you tomorrow," Maggie replied with a smile. Matthew grimaced. Well, she still has the nerve to smile sweetly. Almost ruined the negotiations, amateur polyglot. Gradually, Matthew's anger subsided. After all, beauty works wonders. It's much harder to stay angry at a beautiful person than at anyone else. In the end, replacing anger with favor, Matthew embraced Maggie again, hinting at a possible continuation of their affair, but now in the hotel room. Jennifer, on the other hand, had a clearly disastrous day. The phone in her house rang while she was busy preparing dinner. As always, she was making something delicious to please herself and the children. "Hello, Jennifer Anderson? This is Peter Benson's mother," said an irritated female voice on the other end of the line. Jennifer instantly felt a bead of sweat on her forehead. She knew Angelina was a woman of character, and if she called, something was definitely wrong. "Hello, Angelina," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "Jennifer Anderson, do you know that our Peter didn't get accepted?" Angelina's words sounded like a verdict. "To the university?" Jennifer asked timidly. "No, to the sewing and tailoring club." "Of course, to the university. Where else?" Angelina snorted. Jennifer coughed awkwardly. "He failed the exams, you see. Didn't score enough points. And we wanted Peter to be a translator," Angelina continued. "It's a pity, of course, but you yourself said that Peter wasn't prepared for the exams. That he needed to study more and spend more time on practical exercises," Jennifer cautiously noted. "Not prepared? Then who was supposed to teach him, Jennifer Anderson? You're the tutor, aren't you? So it was your job to prepare him for the exams." "I'm sorry, Angelina, I tried. We studied regularly, I explained the material to Peter, tested him, and prepared him. I don't know what else could have been done in this situation," Jennifer replied, barely holding back tears. "You know what, I don't even understand why we paid you so much money. For what? Peter didn't get accepted, and it's your fault. You didn't prepare him." Angelina exploded. "Angelina, please calm down. Well, it's not all lost. We can try applying elsewhere. The world doesn't end with this university," Jennifer protested, now unable to contain her distress. But Angelina had no intention of calming down. "I was counting on you. I thought you'd prepare Peter, and now look. You're responsible for this and also need to compensate for the losses and return the money. But that's not fair. I understand it's hard for you, but it's not my fault." Jennifer tried to speak calmly, but her voice was still trembling. "And who is to blame then? You took the money and didn't deliver results. You need to pay for our son's failure. I won't forgive you for this. You bear full responsibility for everything you didn't do," Angelina shouted into the phone. Jennifer shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh God, what a day this has been. Maybe you planned all this? Wanted to get the money and do nothing? And so you deliberately made sure Peter couldn't get an education. I'm warning you right now, if my husband Alexander Benson finds out about this, you'll be in big trouble." Angelina spat out her latest theory. But Jennifer no longer listened. Turning off the phone, she wearily sank into a chair. The cutlets were burnt, The potatoes turned to mush, and her mood was, quite literally, at zero. But why was she being blamed for the failure? Jennifer had taught Peter conscientiously and had truly invested her whole soul into it. And now this. How could she explain to this crazy mother that there are no guarantees when applying to higher education institutions? There's no certainty in such cases. Jennifer wasn't got to know everything in advance. And what if Angelina really does tell her husband? There had long been unpleasant rumors about Alexander Benson based on his former athlete's biography. People said he was cruel and uncompromising. After his wife's death 10 years ago, he had become even more embittered, turning into a tyrant. Jennifer knew from Peter that Angelina was his stepmother. The relationship between her and her stepson was rather strained, which clearly didn't help the family's harmony. But, in any case, Jennifer had no intention of meddling in other people's lives. She was a teacher, not a family psychologist. Let Alexander deal with his wife, and Jennifer had enough of her own problems. Her mother-in-law, after all, was demanding to see the children. If it were up to Jennifer, she would minimize their communication because very few people could tolerate Brenda Carroll. However, whether she liked it or not, she needed to prepare. Her mother-in-law lived in the suburbs, and they had to take a bus. Of course, Matthew could have easily driven them, but he was always too busy, with one thing or another. On the bus, Jennifer sat by the window, watching the monotonous scenery flashing by on both sides of the road. William sat next to her, gripping the seat as if it were a lifeline. And Donald, like a little chick, cuddled up to his mother, burying his nose in her shoulder. "Mom, are we almost there?" William asked. "Yes, sweetie, not much longer," she replied. Jennifer was burning with curiosity about how it would all turn out. The bus was stuffy, the windows fogged up, and the air was thick with a sweet smell. Whether it was from pastries or something else resembling honey from a beehive. Jennifer felt a lump in her throat. She knew that the person waiting to greet her children wouldn't be a loving grandmother, but an unrepentant shrew who was just waiting for the right moment to assert herself at others' expense. Brenda Carroll considered herself an expert in everything, from raising children to making soup. Everything Jennifer did seemed wrong to her mother-in-law. And the grandchildren? She saw them as living embodiments of all the world's phobias. And so, Jennifer and the children arrived. Her mother-in-law met them and immediately dragged them into the living room, as there was little space in the kitchen. "Donald, don't eat the candy, it'll spoil your appetite," Jennifer ordered, catching her son's hand. "Mom, but it's so tasty," her son protested, showing her a gummy bear. "Oh, what do you know about tasty candies?" Brenda Carroll snorted. And William, as always, looked skinny. "What kind of mother are you that doesn't feed him properly?" She continued, not giving Jennifer a chance to catch her breath. "No, Grandma, I eat. And Mom cooks deliciously," William defended himself. "Sure, you eat 2 sandwiches with tea, and on your birthday, 3. That's your entire meal." The mother-in-law sneered, shaking her head. Jennifer clenched her fists painfully, trying to hide the tremor in her hands. Inside, she was boiling with hurt and anger. Brenda Carroll, "William ate well today, had breakfast at home, and for lunch, we stopped by a cafe before the trip, where he had a cutlet and mashed potatoes," Jennifer said carefully. "At a cafe? Are you out of your mind? Spending money on restaurants but not giving the kids even boiled potatoes. Why are you like this?" Jennifer retorted, feeling her patience begin to snap. "Oh, should I just stay silent, dear? I see the children are hungry. Their cheeks are sunken, like those of starving kittens." Brenda Carroll exclaimed. "They're not hungry. What makes you think that? They're just skinny, as boys their age should be. They're growing, like mushrooms, not day by day, but hour by hour." Jennifer couldn't hold back. But her mother-in-law was already out of control. Thus, the visit had smoothly escalated into a full-blown scandal, with the homeowner being the instigator. "Brenda Carroll, please understand. I'm tired of your constant accusations. You don't give me a moment's peace. You're always criticizing, reproaching me, saying I'm a bad mother, Jennifer said, trying to stay calm. Oh, don't make me laugh, dear. I might not be perfect, but at least I always knew how to raise children properly. Brenda Carroll shot back. And I don't know. I have no idea how to feed my children. How to clothe and raise them. Yes, dear, that's exactly what I think. You took the words right out of my mouth, Brenda Carroll replied with a smirk. Jennifer clenched her fists painfully, feeling a fire ignite in her chest. Please, stop. She whispered desperately, trying to control her anger. And who told you I would stop? I want to speak the truth, even if it's not always pleasant. Jennifer took a deep breath and turned to the window. There's no living with you. If I had known, I would never have come. And what did you expect? Did you think you were in a fairy tale? Do you even know how I lived all these years to raise Matthew? I did everything for my son, raised him, fed him, clothed him. And what do you do? Brenda Carroll said, barely suppressing a laugh. I love Donald and William, and I try to be a good mother to them. Haha, loving them doesn't mean being a good mother. You spoil them, don't teach them about life and work. They'll turn into idlers who can't do anything. And then they'll grow up and won't be able to achieve anything in life. You know what? Life isn't just about being able to chop wood and dig potatoes. William and Donald are learning, playing a lot, and attending clubs. I'm not spoiling them, I just want them to be happy, Jennifer countered, fed up with it all. Sure, love is good, but it shouldn't get in the way of living. The most important thing is work, which brings in money. Jennifer shook her head. There it is again, money. Just like with Matthew. Isn't there anything else that interests them, as if their heads are just calculators? After sitting a bit longer, Jennifer spoke with William and Donald and started getting ready to go home. She warned her sons that if their grandmother mistreated them, they should call her immediately. Brenda Carroll didn't bother to see them off, turning her back to the window. She despised Jennifer with all her heart, considering her a failure and a freeloader. Despite the fact that Jennifer had helped Matthew in every way possible, essentially becoming his in-house translator for free while also tutoring. Jennifer had even left her school job due to her husband's insistence. Matthew had promised her golden mountains but delivered quite the opposite. And now he had completely rejected her services, deciding she would embarrass him in negotiations. Returning home in a terrible mood, Jennifer found herself wishing she wanted nothing more. To rest, to forget it all like a bad dream. Her mother-in-law with her reproaches, Angelina Benson with complaints about Peter's failure to get accepted, and the self-satisfied look on her husband's face when he was leaving for a business trip. Matthew's affairs were going badly. Maggie behaved as if she were his wife, taking too many liberties. Deciding to go shopping, she left a sleeping Matthew in the hotel room and went outside. The beautiful woman was in a great mood. Why be sad when she had ensnared such a promising businessman? Time flew by during her shopping sprees. Hearing her phone ring in her purse, she smiled and immediately answered the call. Maggie, where are you? Matthew snapped into the phone. I'm at the nail salon, Maggie purred. What nail salon? Are you out of your mind? You promised to translate that contract. Gabriel Albertson's secretary already called, asking when I'll sign it. And you're just lounging around? Well, I'm almost done, Maggie dismissed the concern. Matthew looked at the watch on his wrist. There was barely any time left in the workday, and he still needed to review the contract with the lawyer, send it to accounting, and coordinate with suppliers. He wouldn't make it in time. But the most important thing was the translation. Without it, everything was pointless. Maggie, I asked you, if you're not sure about the translation, get someone who knows the language better. You know how important this is to me, Matthew pleaded. Oh, why are you so nervous? I translated everything correctly, nothing to worry about, Maggie smiled, realizing that her lover was now completely in her grasp. Matthew sighed. He didn't even know how to explain to Maggie why her nothing to worry about sounded, at the very least, strange. Especially when it concerned a $1 million deal that could propel his company to new heights. "Well, darling, I'm coming now. Wait for me." "Kisses," Maggie said and hung up. Matthew furrowed his brow and, cooling off a bit, decided to call his wife. The contract translation was saved on his laptop, but he wanted to check Maggie's work. Seeing her husband's name on the screen, Jennifer tensed. "Hello. Is something wrong?" "Listen, Jennifer, it seems there's a problem. My in-house translators translated the contract, but..." "What but?" Jennifer asked, a bit more sharply than usual. "I'm not sure she got it all right. You see, she doesn't know the language perfectly." "Matthew, are you serious? You don't joke about things like this." Jennifer was surprised. "I know, but there's no time to discuss it. Can you check it or..." Matthew flared up. "Yes, of course, send the files. I'm free right now." When Jennifer read the contract in the original language, she was shocked. Her eyes widened in surprise. Grabbing the phone, she nearly shouted, "Matthew, what are you doing? This is a disaster." Matthew turned pale. "What's wrong with it?" "Your hapless translator made errors. As a result, you'll only get half of the profit from the project." "Half? How is that possible?" Matthew exclaimed. She mixed up some points, misinterpreted phrases. "God, what do we do now?" Matthew whispered. "I told you, you can't delegate such responsibility to an amateur. Every letter in documents matters," his wife said, offended. Matthew covered his face with his hands. "There are two options, either redo the contract or withdraw from the partnership," Jennifer added. The prospect took Matthew's breath away. "Oh, Maggie. How could she do this? What a mess." Matthew was about to end the call when Maggie entered the room and immediately began to profess her love and how much she missed him. The young businessman was momentarily distracted and completely forgot that the phone was still on. Jennifer was nearly overcome with shock. At that moment, she heard everything she couldn't have imagined before. In reality, her unfaithful husband had gone on the business trip not only to close the deal, but also to indulge in the arms of a young mistress. Listening to the cooing of the infatuated couple was unbearable. It sounded so unpleasant that it grated on her ears and made it impossible to concentrate. Unable to bear the nonsense any longer, Jennifer ended the call. Then she turned off the phone completely. Tears streamed down her face. Why did she have to endure this? Why was fate so cruel to her at this moment? After all, she had helped her husband in everything, hoped to revive the family business, and achieve success. But, in reality, her main focus was something else entirely, raising their children, which she had studied for several years at university. At that moment, Jennifer remembered Brenda Carroll's boastful words about how well she had raised her son. Jennifer shook her head. Yes, she raised him. Quite a feat, instilled in her son the most necessary qualities for life, she whispered with sadness. Against the backdrop of Matthew's betrayal, all other problems seemed to pale. Jennifer no longer cared that Angelina Campbell was gunning for her or that her mother-in-law was eager to push for a divorce. All she wanted was to lock herself in a room and cry until evening. Jennifer walked along the sidewalk, not paying attention to the road. Passers-by avoided her as if afraid to catch her unhappiness like a virus. For everyone, the sight of a tearful young woman meant something bad that could harm them. No one stopped to comfort her. Everyone simply walked past, pretending to be in a hurry. Jennifer had no place to hurry to. Her sons were staying with their grandmother, who intended to teach them something useful. And her husband was enjoying the company of his mistress and didn't even think about coming home. Not only that, but Matthew had the audacity to send her a copy of the contract that his mistress couldn't translate. It was only now that Jennifer realized how dirty her husband had used her all this time. To save money, he had forced his wife to translate business documents while she had been working hard to help the family. In reality, all her efforts had been in vain. Deep down, Jennifer regretted having spent so many years of her life on her husband. Essentially, Matthew had never helped her and only did what he thought was necessary. Listening to his mother's advice, he tried to burden Jennifer with problems to offload his own concerns. Jennifer had no doubt she would file for divorce. She understood that she couldn't continue living with a cheater. And what would be the point when Matthew's character was already formed and unlikely to change, especially with his mother's support, who would probably see nothing unusual in what happened. She would say that life has its ups and downs and that minor troubles shouldn't be focused on. Yet, she herself had divorced 3 years after her marriage, never explaining the reason for her decision and keeping it all a secret. Not that Jennifer was overly curious, but still, such a perfect and exemplary mother-in-law, and then an early divorce. As they say, even the sun has its spots. Deep down, Jennifer suspected that the cause might be the betrayal of Matthew's biological father, who had left his family just as he had, rushing to chase another beauty. Jennifer walked down the street, trying not to meet the eyes of passers-by. After all, they say the eyes are the mirror of the soul. And so, anyone could see in them the unbearable sorrow and sadness. Jennifer didn't want to tell anyone or share her pain. Somehow, she had never made any real friends. Sure, she had acquaintances from her teaching university, but they hadn't been in touch for a long time. Jennifer's mother lived in the suburbs and worked as a veterinarian on a local farm. Vivian Daniels would hardly be pleased with what her daughter had to say. She had been happy with her marriage to Matthew and had never criticized her son-in-law. Perhaps it was due to the smoke and mirrors created by Matthew, who was skilled at making a good impression on trusting and melancholic people. It was only when Jennifer saw his true face that she realized her husband was more like a peacock, showing off his tail when meeting an interesting lady, hiding his true motives. Jennifer had almost reached home when the local janitor, Adam Davis, called out to her quietly. Reluctantly, she turned around and saw the elderly man holding a tiny puppy, which, squinting its eyes, was moving its nose from side to side, trying to understand what was happening. Jennifer had always had a good rapport with the janitor and made an effort to greet him and ask how he was doing. But today, her mood was so dreadful that she didn't want to talk to Adam Davis about anything. Besides, how could she talk when tears flowed freely from her eyes and her heart ached with unbearable, throbbing pain? As if sensing what was happening with her, Adam Davis was the first to start the conversation. "Jennifer, there's a situation. Could you help me out and take this puppy in? I live in a one-room place. Where can I keep him? I already took in 2 kittens after their mother was hit by a car. If I bring in a dog, you understand, goodbye peace, for me, my neighbors, and the pets." Jennifer looked at the tiny baby with pity, a small spot on its forehead resembling a star. "What a cutie," she said, forcing a smile. At that moment, thoughts of Matthew and his betrayal gradually faded into the background. The love for her little furry friend outweighed the bitterness of betrayal and made her take the puppy in her arms. As soon as the puppy was with Jennifer, it quieted down and began to lick her finger with its tiny rough tongue. Tears of joy now welled up in her eyes. Holding the little one close to her chest, Jennifer smiled at Adam Davis. "You know what? I'll take him and name him Bryony for his distinctive color. Look how dark his fur is." The janitor smiled and nodded in agreement. "Take him, of course. I know dogs well, believe me, he will make an excellent guard dog. He won't cause any trouble in the house. And he was born with character. See how dark his mouth is? Such pups always show their temperament." Jennifer thanked Adam Davis for the little miracle he had given her. She also imagined how delighted William and Donald would be to see the new member of their family. Of course, their father would no longer be in the family. Well, he would be, but only when he wanted to see his children on the court-specified days. Matthew, on the other hand, realized too late the mistake he had made. Remembering the phone, he ran to it and saw that Jennifer had ended the call first. Great, now I've had a fight with my wife," he exclaimed in frustration. Maggie approached silently from behind, like a cat. "Oh, don't be so glum. Everything will work out. And if not, you have a replacement. Not worse either. I'm also a translator and know several languages, just like your wife." At the mention of translation, Matthew grimaced. He didn't want to tell Maggie directly that she had made a critical mistake and nearly jeopardized his company. Who knew how things would turn out? Maybe now he would have to stay with her. Though, deep down, Matthew was 99% sure that Jennifer would forgive him for his infidelity and accept things as they were to save the family. That meant he could continue to enjoy Maggie's company, who, although she knew languages, didn't master any of them perfectly. So, Matthew would be unlikely to take her to negotiations again. Trying to gently explain to Maggie that she had made an error in translating the documents, Matthew dialed Gabriel Albertson's secretary to inform him of the corrections in the contract. However, a very unpleasant surprise awaited the young businessman. Through his translator, Gabriel Albertson patiently listened to all the arguments and then got to the point. It turned out that the young businessman could not cancel the deal according to the pre-approved agreement. "What do you mean I can't? What's going on? What news is this?" Matthew exclaimed, struggling to control his irritation. In response, Gabriel Albertson only smirked and shook his head. "You know, young man, you need to pay closer attention to all the points of the contract. And generally, to what you're signing," the elderly businessman replied through the translator. At that moment, Matthew remembered how, at the very end of the meeting, one of the foreign assistant's aides had slipped him a strange document for signing. According to the businessman, it wasn't anything serious and served more as a confirmation of their mutual friendship than anything of actual significance. Naturally, in his joy, Matthew signed the document without a second thought about the consequences. Now, thanks to Gabriel Albertson's clever maneuver, he was losing a portion of the amount he had hoped to earn. Maggie, on the other hand, could only shrug and look surprised, claiming that she was just a small-time person who only knew how to translate. But for a while now, Matthew had realized that Maggie was good for nothing more than fluttering her eyelashes and pouting. Her true calling was to be a kept woman to a wealthy businessman who would provide for her every need, while she played the role of a leech, getting everything she wanted. Realizing his mistake, Matthew clutched his head. Maggie approached and cautiously embraced him. "Darling, stop. You'll see, everything will work out. It must be some sort of prank or joke. There can't be such a thing as having part of your profit seized without signing a contract." Matthew slapped the air in frustration. "That's what you think, cheap doll. You only know how to bat your eyelashes, and that's all you're good for. You got my head all messed up, and I signed without looking. Now Gabriel will remain a partner in my firm. I unknowingly gave him part of my shares, which means he'll have the same voting rights as I do." Maggie's mouth fell open in astonishment, momentarily making her look like a doll, one that every little girl in the world wants. Matthew tried to undo the situation and convince Gabriel Albertson that he had acted recklessly. He hadn't had a chance to properly understand the documents he was signing. The brazen foreigner just laughed and said that no one was to blame for what had happened. Essentially, Gabriel Albertson was right. Matthew had come to the meeting not alone but with his translator, whom he had introduced to everyone present. The fact that Maggie was a complete novice in translation didn't concern him anymore. Thus, by the villainous hand of fate, Matthew had personally shared part of his shares with his overseas partners. Naturally, Gabriel Albertson now had the full right to dispose of part of the profits and handle them as he saw fit. At first, Matthew even tried to consult a lawyer, who, upon seeing the notarized signature, simply shrugged. "Sorry, Matthew Adrian, but I'm powerless here. The foreigners made everything airtight, they're meticulous and never make mistakes in their paperwork. My advice for the future, be more cautious or you'll lose even what you have." Tears welled up in Matthew's eyes. God, how did it come to this? Everything started so wonderfully. I was basking in the embrace, not bothering anyone, while she whispered words of love and promised support. And now it turns out Maggie was just draining my money, treating me like a fool who couldn't tell the real translator Maggie from a deceitful imposter. Maggie didn't forgive Matthew and announced their separation that very day. In his rage, he didn't immediately realize what had happened, and when he did, he ran after Maggie, trying to keep her close. But, as it turned out later, the fatal beauty had not wasted any time and, skillfully fluttering her eyelashes at one of the foreigners, had already arranged a date with him. As they say, strike while the iron is hot. And Maggie knew how to strike that iron better than anyone else, especially when she heard the rustling of high-denomination banknotes. At such moments, she saw only her goal and pursued it relentlessly, no matter what sacrifices were necessary for achieving her most cherished fantasies. The main thing was that her fingers sparkled with expensive rings, her neck was adorned with a costly pendant and chain, and her handbag held the latest model smartphone. Whether her benefactor was a foreigner or a fellow countryman was irrelevant. Realizing he had failed on all fronts, Matthew hurried back home as quickly as possible. Naturally, he hadn't even thought about how he would explain things to his wife or what he would say in his defense. He was so convinced of his own righteousness that he was ready to pretend nothing had happened. But the young businessman didn't know the most important thing: his wife had become someone else, like a butterfly that had emerged from an unremarkable cocoon and was now bringing ethereal beauty and admiration to those around her with her transformation. After taking in the little puppy, Jennifer felt something inside her break. Caring for Bryony, she stubbornly pushed away any negative thoughts. She only thought about filing for divorce and starting a new life. Determined not to waste any time, she called the school principal where she had once worked and asked if there were any job openings. Marcus Adrian thought for a moment, then scratched his head and said, "Well, given your level of knowledge, Jennifer Anderson, I think we can come up with something with our colleagues." A sweet smile appeared on her lips. How pleasant it was to be remembered. And most importantly, to be valued for her qualities and level of knowledge, which she had acquired during her time at the pedagogical university. Jennifer understood that, due to her husband's actions, she had lost several years of her life, which she could have devoted more productively to teaching. On the other hand, everything that happens is for the best. Moreover, when one door closes, life often opens a new one, which turns out to be much better than the previous one. After feeding Bryony warm milk with bread, Jennifer sat in a chair and turned on the TV. Knowing that the children were being taken care of, she tried to relax and organize her thoughts. Brenda Carroll, though a notorious grump, still managed to handle the kids and never mistreated them. At that moment, there was a loud knock on the door, and Jennifer tensed noticeably, glancing at the clock. Who could be coming at this late hour? Could it be her husband? Though, it seemed unlikely, as Matthew had his own key. Puzzled about who it could be, she approached the door and cautiously turned the lock. Her surprise was immense when she saw a tall, broad-shouldered man on the doorstep, Peter Benson's father. The very same Alexander, a former athlete about whom there were rather mixed rumors in town. Catching the hostess's surprised gaze, Alexander asked, "Good evening. May I come in?" Jennifer nodded, still unsure of what to say in her defense. Mentally, she was bracing herself for the guest to start with a scandal and a flood of accusations. To Jennifer's surprise, he behaved quite differently. Seeing the puppy sitting on the warm mat, Alexander bent down and smiled as he scratched its ear. Then, with the homeowner's permission, he sat in a chair and moved directly to the purpose of his visit. "Jennifer Anderson, I know my wife called you." "Yes, that's true," Jennifer replied cautiously, desperately afraid of upsetting her guest with a clumsy word. But Alexander wasn't planning to be angry. On the contrary, he soon said something that made Jennifer's hands tremble uncontrollably. "You see, my wife has unjustly accused you. The thing is, you are not at fault for Peter's failure to get into university. They haven't been getting along for a long time, and so my wife decided to take revenge on him." "Excuse me. What do you mean by revenge?" Jennifer stammered. Alexander shook his head sorrowfully. I understand, it sounds terrible, but it was indeed Angelina's fault that Peter couldn't get into university. You prepared him as needed, but he couldn't study on his own. Angelina wouldn't let him do that. It was deliberately done so that he would fail the entrance exams. A nasty and cunning revenge. Jennifer paled and discreetly wiped away a tear. Indeed, the conversation was not an easy one. When I learned about Peter's failure, I spoke with him immediately. That's when he told me the whole truth, concluded the guest. Jennifer was momentarily speechless with astonishment. All this time she had considered herself guilty of what had happened. And in reality, this cunning stepmother had deliberately ensured that her stepson would not succeed. Truly, a refined revenge. Tears sparkled in Jennifer's eyes, and the businessman's confession touched the most painful strings of her soul. In truth, she couldn't have imagined such malevolence, depriving his stepson of a chance for a proper education and a chance to become a person. But it was simply inconceivable. The most surprising thing was that during the conversation, Alexander turned out to be a rather pleasant man who did not raise his voice or use foul language. In fact, after a while, he decided to thank Jennifer for her help and offered new terms for cooperation. Listen, Jennifer Anderson, please forgive me, but I would like you to continue working with my son. At least for another 6 or 7 months. I spoke with Peter, and he is ready to try again next year, but only with your direct support and involvement, Alexander began cautiously. Jennifer shyly shrugged. Yes, I don't mind, but how will your wife react? You know, after all that's happened, I won't be able to face her and look her in the eye. Alexander smiled and added, Well, you needn't worry about that. We've separated, and I've already filed for divorce. I don't think it's worth starting a family life with such cases, where someone deliberately seeks revenge on their relatives for their own ambitions. Jennifer nodded in agreement and then, realizing her manners, offered coffee. They talked for about an hour and a half, after which a company car arrived to pick up Alexander. From that moment on, changes began to take place in Jennifer's life. Upon learning that Matthew was returning home, she packed her belongings into 2 suitcases and moved into an apartment that a longtime acquaintance had helped her find. Of course, it wasn't the most luxurious, but it was her own space, from which no one could evict her except the landlord. Right after that, Jennifer picked up Donald and William from Brenda Carroll to prevent her mother-in-law from potentially blackmailing her with the children. The boys' joy was boundless when they saw little Bryony rush to greet them. From their enthusiastic reaction, Jennifer immediately realized she had made the right choice. It turned out the children had long been dreaming of a dog and were just waiting for the moment when their mother would give them such a gift. Despite pleas and apologies for forgiveness, Jennifer completely severed ties with Matthew and began a new life. On weekdays, she worked at the school, and on weekends, she gave extra lessons to Alexander's son, Peter. Under her guidance, the young man significantly improved his knowledge of foreign languages and, in Jennifer's opinion, showed great promise in this area. Unknowingly to herself, Jennifer developed a respect for his father, who, in reality, turned out to be not the rough character the gossip had painted him as. He was indeed a stern person but acted with integrity. He never hurt defenseless and weak people. Jennifer enjoyed her work at the school. Primarily because, for most of the day, she was surrounded by children who listened to and absorbed every word she said. Meanwhile, Matthew behaved badly and even tried to strip her of parental rights by appealing to the relevant authorities. But thanks to Alexander Benson's help and intervention, the bankrupt businessman faced a complete fiasco in this arena as well. 6 months after their introduction, Alexander proposed to Jennifer. Naturally, this was not unexpected for Jennifer. Although there was a little over an 8-year age difference between them, in the eyes of the lovers, it was a mere trifle, especially considering the sincere and strong feelings they shared. Alexander proposed to Jennifer in front of his son Peter, who gladly approved of his father's choice. In truth, Peter had long regarded her as a mother, eagerly absorbing every word she said to gain the necessary skills in translation. Moreover, the young man was quite happy to become an older brother to William and Donald, who, despite being considerably younger, already considered him a part of their family. Many of Jennifer's colleagues attended the wedding, delighted that she had finally turned her life around for the better. Of course, her mother was the happiest of all.